Welcome to Silent Screams, where the shadows come alive and every whisper feels like a scream in the dark. Tonight, we bring you a tale that unravels in the quietest hours, just as fear begins to settle in. As you listen, remember that not everything that appears before you is simply a trick of the mind. Sometimes the nightmare is real, just waiting for you to notice. The night was unusually quiet. Even the hum of the city seemed to have dimmed, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Emily was wide awake, staring at the ceiling of her darkened bedroom. It was past midnight, and a strange, uneasy feeling gnawed at her. She'd lived in this house for nearly 5 years and had never felt anything quite like this before. An eerie sense of being watched, of something or someone lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. She had tried everything to get to sleep, closing her eyes, counting sheep, focusing on her breathing. But no matter what she did, her heart wouldn't stop racing, and her skin prickled with the oddest sensation. There was a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the air itself were weighed down by something invisible and foreboding. Emily tried to shake off the feeling, convincing herself that it was just her imagination. After all, she'd been under a lot of stress lately, with work deadlines looming and countless nights of restless sleep. She took a deep breath, pulled a blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. But just as she began to drift off, a soft creak sounded from somewhere down the hall. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Houses make noises. But there was something off about this sound. It wasn't the usual creak of the floor settling or the distant hum of the refrigerator. This noise was different, slow, deliberate, as though someone was pacing in the hallway outside her room. Emily swallowed, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She listened carefully, straining her ears. There it was again, a faint, almost rhythmic creak, followed by a soft scraping sound. She held her breath, the silence amplifying each small noise, and a chill ran down her spine. The sound grew louder, as if it were coming closer. Deciding that it was better to check than lie there in fear, Emily slipped out of bed, her feet sinking into the cool carpet. She tiptoed toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. Slowly, she opened it just a crack and peeked into the hallway. It was dark, the only light coming from a faint glow at the far end of the corridor. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was enough to cast long, eerie shadows along the walls. "Hello," she whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. Silence answered her. She took a step into the hallway, her bare feet making almost no sound on the hardwood floor. The house seemed to breathe around her, the walls creaking softly as she moved forward. She kept her eyes fixed on the end of the hallway, where the strange light flickered ever so slightly, almost as if it were moving. Then she saw it, a shadow barely visible, slipping into the room at the far end of the hall. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow was tall, much taller than she was, and its movements were unnatural, almost jerky, like a puppet with invisible strings. She wanted to turn back, to lock herself in her room and hide under the covers, but something compelled her to move forward. She took another step, and then another, each one slower than the last. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, loud and insistent, and she could feel the cold sweat prickling at her temples. As she reached the doorway to the last room, she stopped, her hand hovering just inches from the frame. The room was bathed in an eerie, bluish glow that seemed to have no source. The light cast strange shadows across the walls, and in the center of the room, facing away from her, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long and gaunt, as if someone had stretched it beyond human limits. Its head was cocked to one side, almost like it was listening for something. Emily's breath hitched, and she clapped a hand over her mouth, trying to stifle a gasp. The figure shifted slightly, its head twitching ever so slightly toward her, as if it sensed her presence. She felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but her legs were frozen in place, her body refusing to obey her commands. The figure began to turn, its movement slow and deliberate, and as it did, Emily felt a chill so deep it seemed to seep into her very bones. When it finally faced her, she could barely comprehend what she was seeing. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a twisted, distorted mass of shadows and darkness. There were no eyes, no mouth, only an endless void where a face should have been. And yet, somehow, she knew it was looking at her, seeing her, even though it had no eyes. Emily's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She wanted to scream, to run, but all she could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, as the apparition took a slow, shuddering step toward her. Its arms hung limply at its sides, fingers twitching, as if barely restrained by some invisible force. A faint whisper filled the room, so soft it was barely more than a breath. But it wasn't a single voice, it was a chorus, overlapping and echoing, each voice whispering her name in a sickly sweet tone. Emily, Emily. The sound wrapped around her, cold and cloying, like icy fingers pressing against her skin. She tried to back away, but her legs felt like they were stuck in quicksand, refusing to budge. The figure took another step, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were fighting against its own body. Just as it was about to reach her, a loud crash echoed from somewhere downstairs, shattering the silence and breaking the trance. Emily stumbled back, her legs finally obeying, and she turned, running, back down the hallway as fast as her shaking legs would carry her. She could feel the air grow colder behind her, a presence following her, closing in with every step. She raced down the stairs, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, and burst into the living room. The crash had come from the kitchen, where a chair lay overturned on the floor, and the faint smell of something burnt lingered in the air. But before she could process what she was seeing, a low guttural growl echoed from the shadows in the corner of the room. Emily spun around, her eyes wide, scanning the room for the source of the sound. The shadows seemed to deepen, growing thicker, almost as if they were alive. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, until she felt the cold, unyielding surface of the wall behind her. She was trapped, with nowhere to run. And then, out of the darkness, a pair of eyes appeared. They glowed faintly, a sickly yellowish color, staring at her with an intensity that felt like it could pierce right through her soul. The growling grew louder, reverberating through the room, and she could see the faint outline of a figure emerging from the shadows. The figure was hunched over, its body twisted and contorted, as if it had been broken and reassembled in the most horrifying way possible. Its limbs jutted out at unnatural angles, and its skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over bones that seemed ready to burst through at any moment. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes never leaving hers, and as it drew closer, Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She pressed herself harder against the wall, her fingers clawing at the surface, desperate for any way out. The figure reached out a hand, if it could even be called a hand. The fingers were long and skeletal, with sharp, claw-like nails that scraped against the floor as it moved. It was so close now that she could feel its icy breath against her skin, smell the faint, rancid odor that clung to it. Just as she was about to scream, a loud, sharp knock sounded from the front door, breaking the tense silence.